Before we start, let's quickly recapitulate the discussions of the previous two videos where we have talked about how mathematics models reality as objects, but this object modeling doesn't work for any language, including mathematics, because languages also have meanings and references. We talked about a simple model of a word with three aspects and how that solves the problem of incompleteness. Our prescription was therefore to model the world like a language rather than like objects. When reality is modeled like a language, then every individual thing is like a word that comprises many meanings. The word is all the meanings, but none of the meanings are the word. Due to multiple meanings of a word, the one-to-one word meaning mapping is broken. Hence, Aristotelian logic does not apply. But this change is extremely useful because now everything can be modeled as a word. Even food is like a word, such that food is taste and smell, but taste and smell are not food. A car is both chassis and steering, but a chassis and steering are not the car. This brings us to interesting questions about whole and part. They did not exist in Greek thinking and have never existed in modern science. But there is a history behind why whole part thinking has not existed in the West. Let's briefly cover those reasons. During Greek times, a man was a singular form, not comprised of many parts. A man who had all his body parts intact was the perfect man. But if a man lost a finger, he was not less than a man, he was still just an imperfect man. If a man had extra fingers, then too he was not more than a man, he was just an imperfect man. Therefore, man was a singular thing, just one form, which had incarnated into a material substance. This thinking is problematic because the notion of a man is not precise. We could have one less finger or some extra finger. To make this definition precise, reductionism was created during Enlightenment in Europe. Now a man was a set of parts. A man with one less finger or with one extra finger was no longer a man. Either a man was a perfect man or he was not at all a man. The flexibility of man having more or less fingers was gone. The precise collection of all parts was called a set, and the irreducible entities in the set were called objects. Now we got two tiers of description. Logic pertains to irreducible entities called objects, while set theory pertains to collections of irreducible entities or possibly other sets. Both of these are problematic. For example, if we remove the man's head, then the whole of man is gone. But if we just cut a finger, then almost the whole man is present. Thus, man is completely gone by removing one part, namely the head, and remains intact by removing other parts, namely the fingers. Therefore, a man cannot be called totally reducible or irreducible. Removing the head makes a man not a man, but removing the finger doesn't do so. Therefore, a man is somewhere in between reducible and irreducible. Man is reducible as far as hands and legs are concerned, but irreducible as far as head and chest are concerned. When we take the whole man into account, then he is neither reducible nor irreducible. Due to this non-binary condition, we can neither apply logic nor set theory to man because logic applies to irreducible entities and set theory applies to reducible entities. But a man is neither totally reducible nor totally irreducible. Hence, both logic and set theory fail for man. This is true for all things. There is some crucial minimal ingredient whose absence makes it not that thing. But there are other optional things too. For example, food should be nutritious. That is the bare minimum requirement. Other things like smell and taste are optional. If smell and taste are present, but there is no nutrition, then we cannot call it food. But if nutrition is present without smell and taste, then it is food, although not the ideal food. The basic structure of a concept is like the basic structure of an atom, namely, that there is an essential core, kernel, or nucleus that makes it that concept. But there are peripheral additions to that essential core which embellish, enhance, and complement that core of the concept. For example, nutrition is core to food, but smell and taste are optional. Head and heart are core to a man, but hands and legs are optional. When all the optional parts are present, then we can say that it is a perfect man or perfect food. When the optional parts are absent, then it is an imperfect man or food. Atomism is so fundamental that we have to think of every word as an atom. Every word, such as a president, has a core component such as leadership. It could be the leadership of a football club, a company, or even a country. Those are peripheral to president. If the nucleus of leadership is present, then a person can be president of anything. But without the nucleus, he is not a president of anything. This is the nature of all concepts. However, this is neither set theory nor logic. In Aristotelian logic, each thing is just one thing, not a core and periphery. There is no essential or inessential part of anything because it is just one thing. Similarly, in set theory, we cannot remove something peripheral and say that it is still the same thing as before. Every part of a set is equally important to it being that set. The moment we remove even one element from a set, it becomes not that set. Therefore, the core construct of language and science should be a concept which is like an atom, but that is neither logic nor set theory. Similarly, whenever we talk about atoms, we can also call them as words and concepts with a kernel and a periphery. An atom doesn't have to be a physical entity because it is the very nature of all concepts. This leads us to a question. How did people miss such trivial and fundamental things for thousands of years? The answer is simple. They were not missed in the Vedic system. They were just missed in Western philosophy, religion, and science because there was no understanding of concepts. What is core and what is the periphery of a concept has never been discussed in Western thinking. It is either one thing or it is not that thing. It cannot be something in between. This dualistic or binary thinking of good versus evil, God versus Satan, black or white, is the enemy of rationality. But this enemy of rationality has been the only type of rationality in Western thinking. Nobody tried to dissect a man into essential and inessential components. So they did not realize that head is essential and legs are inessential. Essence was the whole thing, not the core of that thing. Dualisms further worsened the problem because mathematics was in the Platonic world, and each word, such as a circle, had only one meaning. There could not be more than one meaning of a circle. This dualism was broken when mathematicians started talking about proving theorems using machines or computers, which were in the real world. The moment that dualism was broken, words acquired more than one meaning. For example, the word circle can refer to a class of things or just one specific circular thing. The class of things was in the Platonic world, but the specific thing is in this world. The same word can be used for both. Mathematics cannot handle that. Breaking the dualism means breaking mathematics. After establishing that mathematics is broken, Godel again became a Platonist rather than a realist. If we take Gödel's position seriously, then anyone can elevate any unprovable claim to a Platonic world idea. That is precisely what many religions do. They accept that their claims are unprovable, but they consider them Platonic truths that have to be accepted on blind faith. Therefore, Platonism is the cop out from trying to establish anything by reason or evidence. Gödel's mathematical Platonism was precisely equal to blind faith. The reason these problems have never been realized in the West is because a deep analysis of the problem was never done, and it was always replaced by some kind of blind faith. Whenever a new problem arose, instead of solving that problem, a new dualism was created, as if a dualism is a solution to any problem. Every new problem was solved by creating a new dualism. But the moment that dualism is broken, the whole thing falls apart again. And then we have to go back to blind faith. Behind this problem is a much larger story about Western philosophy, religion, and science that we cannot cover in detail at this juncture, but I will try to briefly summarize it here. The most relevant part of our story begins with Aristotle. When he realized that Platonism is a junk philosophy, because I can claim that my car is the ideal car and call it the incarnation of the pure form of a car in the Platonic world. It doesn't solve any problem because someone else can claim that their car is the ideal car. No philosophical debates can ever be settled by Platonism. So Aristotle decided to junk Platonism. He did not overtly criticize Plato, but he separated Platonic forms into two categories, which he called theoretical and practical. In the theoretical category, there were forms like a circle, square, triangle, hexagon, etc. In the practical category, there were forms like poetry, literature, art, music, dance, etc. The basic idea behind this separation is that we can precisely conclude if something is an ideal circle or not. But we can never precisely conclude whether some poetry, music, art, literature, or dance is ideal. Therefore, Platonism in general became a junk philosophy, but it was partially salvaged if we restricted its application only to geometry and arithmetic. Now we have to remember that Aristotle did not claim that poetry, music, art, literature, and dance were reducible to geometry and arithmetic. That reduction of practical forms to theoretical forms came much later. During Aristotle's time, his claim was only that there are forms about which we can say precise things, and there are forms about which nothing can be said precisely. And therefore, theoretical and practical were separated, and science was confined to the theoretical forms. Science did not apply to the whole world. Specifically, science did not apply to poetry, music, art, dance, literature, and so on. It was precisely restricted to geometry and arithmetic. After the Greeks, many centuries passed like this and nothing changed. However, during this period, after the 7th century, Islam rose to power and conquered many parts of northern Africa and Europe. Islamists converted Africans and Europeans to Islam, and Christianity was rapidly losing its power. Islam portrayed itself as a scientific civilization because Arabs had algebra, geometry, arithmetic, etc., while Christianity was still living without even a zero in their number system. Christians realize that if they don't give greater importance to science, then they will not be able to stop the Islamic convergence. This is when the Christian race towards science began. In this race, Christians took everything from Arabs, including the Arabic numeral system, algebra, and so on. However, this process had a limit because Arabs stopped advancing science after a while. Since Christians were totally reliant on Arabs, they could also not create new breakthroughs in science unless something drastically new happened. The drastic change happened when Christians started talking about science as something derived from empirical observation of reality. This is when Copernicus and Galileo ran into trouble with the church. Rationalism was fine, but empiricism was not. To solve this problem, Christians had to reduce empirical science to rational science. This was achieved by saying that all of the empirical world is governed by mathematics, not just one or two parts of the world. Rather, the whole world was governed by mathematics. Of course, there was no proof of that. So Christians started saying that God was a geometer and mathematical thinker. If God thinks only in Greek and Latin, then there is a conflict between religion and science. But if God thinks in mathematics, in addition to Greek and Latin, then there is no conflict between religion and science. Thus, Christians started saying that by learning mathematics, we could know the mind of God as far as the material world is concerned, because God made the world a perfectly mathematical world. By learning Greek and Latin, people could know religion, but by learning mathematics, they would know the world. This knowledge of the world was useful in advancing the power of the Christian civilization materially, so it was accepted. Thereby, the distinction between theoretical and practical forms, which Aristotle had created, was kept aside, forgotten, or rejected. The whole world came under mathematics because God created the world. God was a mathematical thinker, and therefore the whole world had to be mathematical. Mathematics was the language of science, while Greek or Latin was the language of religion. Even if we could not immediately reduce poetry, music, art, literature, and dance to geometry and arithmetic, over time we would. This was the assumption of enlightenment. Of course, it was a false assumption. In the 20th century, not just mathematics but major branches of physics underwent transformations, resulting in problems that are still unsolved today. The strategy of science has remained the same, however, namely, what we cannot do today, we will do tomorrow. There is no evidence for that, it is just an article of faith. Therefore, we can summarize the entire problem of the mathematical history in three sentences. 1. Philosophy separated the theoretical forms from the practical forms. 2. Religion dissolved this separation and merged all the forms into a world created by God under the laws of mathematics. 3. Every area of science ran into problems and disproved the merger. We are now back to the Aristotelian separation of theoretical and practical forms. Under the separation, we don't know how the world works, but we can use geometry and arithmetic to do some practical day-to-day things. The deep reason for this problem is that scientists never respected Aristotelian separation of theoretical and practical forms, nor did they formulate alternative strategies for logic and mathematics, before claiming that God was a geometer and mathematical thinker. They just ignored all the difficulties and reasons and kept marching ahead. The problems now are the result of those flawed assumptions. Given that we now know about these problems, we can say that reality should not exist in separate worlds, namely the Platonic world, the real world, and the material world. If reality is so separated, then we cannot know reality. Similarly, reality cannot exist in a single world of material objects, because if the world is just material objects, then language is not possible. Without language, there will be no knowledge. Therefore, reality must exist in a single world, that is, three distinct worlds. That is the reality in which language can exist. In fact, it is reality that we can precisely model after language. As we have discussed in previous videos, it is a reality in which words have three aspects of object, meaning, and reference. Thus far, I have not used any reference to Vedic philosophy because I wanted to establish the problem and its solution without any Vedic reference. But now that we have all that behind us, I can introduce the basic concept of nature based on the three guna in Sāñkhya philosophy, which are called sattva, rajas, and tamas. There are many incarnations of these guna, but in one such incarnation, tamas is the object, rajas is the reference to an object, and sattva is the meaning or type of that object. Everything is produced as a combination of these three guna. Therefore, everything is like a symbol of meaning or a word. That symbol's individual existence can be likened to an object. Its meaning is just like a Platonic form, and its reference to other things that are also symbols is just like our minds refer to the external world. Therefore, a symbol is the combination of three worlds, namely the material world, the Platonic world, and the mental world. As a result, we don't have to talk about a mental world separate from the material world because a reference is in the world. Likewise, meaning is also in the world. Three worlds become one world, but it is not the world spoken of in Aristotelian logic, modern mathematics, or any current scientific subjects. The assumption in all science is three separate worlds. Sāñkhya makes it one world, but with three separate faces. We can see all the faces in this world, but we cannot see them simultaneously. Many people have a problem with inserting meaning and reference into the material world, but they often don't know about the three separate worlds assumed in Western thinking since antiquity, and they certainly don't know how to resolve this separation of worlds. Their preference for keeping meaning and reference out of the material world is simply their acclimatization to dualism and trialism. For them, we can either offer the alternative of Sāñkhya or let them deal with the problems of their dualism and trialism. Sāñkhya describes the process of creation, maintenance, and destruction of the universe based on the three guna. The creation of the world is the combination of the guna. The destruction of the world is separation of the guna. And maintenance of the world is when we see the many faces of the combination one after another. The guna combination is a very extensive topic that I will not try to cover here. But briefly, each guna enters the other guna, and that entry of one guna into another guna becomes a combination. When the guna exits the guna that it has previously entered, it becomes a separation of guna. Entry of the guna is creation, exit of the guna is destruction, and seeing the guna that have entered each other one after another is maintenance. The guna themselves are never created or destroyed. They are eternal. They are just like three separate entities that have been combined to produce a phenomena. When these realities separate, then the phenomena disappears, but reality as guna continues. Therefore, matter as three guna is eternal. Everything is always conserved, but the combinations of guna are not always visible. There is a fundamental reason why mathematics is a bad ideology for nature, comprising three guna, namely that guna combination does not follow the laws of arithmetic. If we cannot uphold the truth of arithmetic, then all downstream subjects such as algebra, geometry, and calculus also cannot be upheld. There are three basic laws of arithmetic called the commutative, distributive, and associative properties of number additions and multiplications. Each of these three properties are violated by the guna. Since nature is guna, and guna don't follow the laws of arithmetic addition and multiplication, therefore, nature also doesn't follow mathematics in general, although it can be selectively useful in some cases, as we will shortly discuss. The general case is that nature is not mathematical. The rare exceptional case is that mathematics is sometimes useful to us. The general pattern arising out of guna combination is an inverted tree. At the root of the tree is an I or self or an individual person. This person has three aspects called Sat, Chit, and Anand, which is a separate subject in itself that I will not go into here. The guna enter these three aspects of the person, and nature starts expanding and diversifying like a tree. People at present say that the universe is expanding. We can agree with that. Yes, it is expanding because the tree of diversification is expanding. But the universe will not always expand. It will sometimes contract and then expand and then contract and then expand. This cyclical behavior continues for a long time and ultimately the universe collapses into the root or the I. While the universe is expanding, it is expanding like a tree. If we talk about A plus A, then the second A is the branch emanating from the trunk. The emanated branch is not a real addition to the trunk. It was previously inside the trunk. And yet, by the emanation, additional details about the branch are known, quite like we know an author by the books he authors. Before the author authored the book was already within the author. After the author has authored the author hasn't been reduced or increased. And yet, from the perspective of the readers, the book is an additional thing. This additional thing that we call the book is always tied to the author. It is not an independent object. The author can modify the book if he wants. Thereby, all arithmetic operations come down to adding and removing trunks, branches, twigs, and leaves on the tree. A plus B is not the same as B plus A because they correspond to different trunks and branches. A plus A is not 2A because the author has simply produced his autobiography. The first A is the author and the second A is his autobiography. They are not 2A. What they are requires a guna combination logic, which is a non-binary logic. If we look at the inverted tree carefully, we will realize the importance of sequences of letters. We can illustrate this importance further by ordinary English examples. Consider just two words, namely science and economy. There is a science of economy and there is an economy of science. There is also an economy of science of economy. The sequence of word combination is incredibly important in ordinary language, but it has no importance in mathematics. We can add any two numbers in any order, but we cannot add words in any order. The order of words is most important to understand what the combination of words means. This is also the central concern of Sāñkhya. The order of guna addition is paramount. A slight change in the order will drastically change what the thing overall means. Mathematics cannot model that drastic change. Therefore, to study guna, a good analogy is ordinary language rather than mathematics. The science of guna is extensively studied as the science of language. Just like modern science uses various mathematical models, similarly, Sāñkhya science studies various kinds of sentences. How does the presence of one word change the meaning of another word? What does a combination of words mean? What role does a time, place, or situation have on the word combination meaning? How will we understand that same combination in another time, place, and situation? There is a precise system of studying these combinations, and that is the foundation of Sāñkhya science. It comes naturally as the result of rejecting mathematics as the language of nature and reinstating the essence of science as the study of words. In one sense, we have just replaced numbers by words. Nothing much has changed by that replacement. But in another sense, all the rules of the game have changed, beginning with the basic rules of number addition and multiplication. Therefore, those who think that there is only one type of science, namely Western science, may want to think of an alternative science that arises by replacing numbers with words. Of course, these are not ordinary English words. They are precisely framed words, but they are words nevertheless. Thus, an alternative science emerges from the idea that what we are adding and subtracting in nature are not numbers. Rather, they are addition and subtraction of words governed by completely different rules. The general principle of word combination is that all basic rules of number addition are violated. We can see that through ordinary examples of sentences, such as the non-equivalence of the phrases like the science of economy and the economy of science. The economy of country nutrition is not the sum of the country economy and the nutrition economy. Rather, the country economy includes the nutrition economy, and the nutrition economy is a part of the country economy. Therefore, sometimes when we are adding and multiplying words, the produced entity is reduced rather than increased. At other times, we can modify it, increase it drastically, and so on. All mathematical rules are violated by ordinary language word combinations. This leads us to a natural question about the role of mathematics in our life. If nature is word combinations rather than number arithmetic, then why does mathematics work so well, ever so often? The answer is again based on guna combination. We can take the simple example of adding sugar to milk to produce sweet milk. This looks like a number addition. The reason is that milk and sugar are mostly orthogonal properties. Adding them is like adding a new branch, twigs, and leaves to a tree without affecting the previous branches, twigs, and leaves. That, however, is not true for adding salt to milk. Salt can change the properties of milk, unlike sugar that does not. Therefore, adding salt to milk is modifying the previous branches, twigs, and leaves. But adding sugar to milk is like adding branches with minimal or no modification. Mathematics works fine when we have non-interfering branches. We can treat these non-interfering branches as independent objects to a reasonable degree of approximation. Mathematics works in such cases. However, these are so few compared to the general case of interfering branches that in the overall scheme of things, they're just negligible. We can illustrate the case of an interfering branch addition with another example of adding a triangle and a circle to get a circular triangle. Note how two things have different shapes, but one of the two shapes has to be dominant and the other has to be subordinate. If the triangle is dominant, then the circle will produce a circular triangle. But if the circle is dominant, then the triangle will produce a triangular circle. A circular triangle is not exactly the same as a triangular circle because the order of addition is very important. Note also how the addition is not adding a branch unchanged. It is rather modifying the branch by adding a leaf. In this combination, we cannot truly separate triangle and circle. They have become inseparable. However, we can still look at this circular triangle sometimes as a circle and sometimes as a triangle. It needs different perspectives to see different things. So two distinct things are present that look like just one thing. Due to one thing, the circular triangle is not separable into circle and triangle, and yet circle and triangle are still distinctly present. In these cases, mathematics does not apply. We can summarize the applicability and non-applicability of mathematics in one contrast, namely independence versus entanglement. When two things are independent of each other, then mathematics applies. But if two things are entangled with each other, then mathematics does not apply. Entanglement can be understood by the example of a family. The identities of people are defined in a family in relation to each other. If one person in the family falls sick, then everyone in the family suffers. If one person is happy, then everyone becomes happy. This is an easy example of entanglement. Similarly, in the Vedic conception, the entire reality is just like one gigantic family. Even nature, animals, plants, mountains, and rivers are included in the family. In this conception of reality, mathematics doesn't apply. But in individualistic cultures, each person is independent of the other person. There is no concept of family, let alone animals, plants, mountains, and rivers being within the family. In such a culture, everything is modeled as an independent thing. People who are born and raised in an individualistic culture cannot understand entanglement because their identity has never been defined in relationship to anyone. They are taught to be things in themselves rather than things of others and things for others. They too conceptualize the world like independent things. Therefore, science is also influenced by religion and culture because religion and culture makes the science either individualistic or collectivistic. When a society becomes more individualist, then it can be better modeled using mathematics. When a society becomes more collectivist, then it cannot be modeled using mathematics. Therefore, the applicability of mathematics can also be increased by breaking down the family structure, social bonds, uh, and the filial bond with nature. Of course, it is not recommended, but it is possible. This principle of entanglement is called BHEDA-ABHEDA, which means distinctness without separation. Everything is modeled like an organism. Everyone is part of a cosmic organism. The parts of the organism are distinct, but the parts are not independent of each other. Since there are two distinct parts, therefore we cannot say it is only one thing. But since the parts are not independent, therefore we cannot say it is two things. It is something in between one and two. If the entanglement between parts increases, then the organism goes closer to one thing. If the entanglement between parts decreases, then the organism goes closer to two things. But it is never exactly one and never exactly two. It is always something in between. This is the breakdown of mathematics. Two things are neither exactly two things nor exactly one thing. They are something in between. What they are in between one and two also varies with time, place, and situation. Therefore, science is defined as the study of this change, namely, are two things moving closer to two or are they moving closer to one? There is no objective truth here. Two things can be close to one thing or close to two things. Therefore, this changing reality is called a myth. It moves between one and two. But if two things remain something constant between one and two, then that situation is called the truth. Basically, change is myth and constant is truth. Sankhya is the foundation of BHEDA-ABHED because we can understand it through easy examples such as music and art. The art of an artist affects his music, and the music of a musician affects his art. We cannot say that art and music are just one thing, and we cannot say that they are two independent things. There is something in between one and two. They can never be precisely one or two, but sometimes music will evolve while art is stagnant, and at other times art will evolve while music is stagnant. Thereby they come closer to either one or two. This is non-binary logic. It is the universal truth. Mathematics is not universal truth, but when two things go closer to being two separate things, then mathematics applies more. In the Vedic system, both science and religion mean realizing this entangled nature of reality. They are not in separate worlds. They are true everywhere, but more true somewhere and less true elsewhere. People who grew up in India also grew up with this family organism concept of whole reality, because this is the central thing in Vedic philosophy. Even those who were mathematicians did not take mathematics very seriously because they knew that its assumptions of independence and separability are not true. It can be truer in some cases than others. Its truth can also change with time. But overall, it is contradictory to the fundamental principles of nature and of the Bhed-Abhed principle in Sāñkhya. Therefore, they treated mathematics like a tool, a utility, rather than as truth. The simple difference resulting from Bhed-Abhed is that we don't try to rationally prove that the tool will always work. We just use the tool to solve a specific problem, get the result, and say, look, it has worked, so we can use it in this case. Therefore, Indian mathematicians rarely focused on proving theorems, because a mathematical proof requires the axiom of independence. That axiom is in general false, hence there is no use of wasting our time with proofs when axioms themselves are not universally true. On the other hand, it is useful to say that in this case, the axiom is more applicable than others, so we will use mathematics like a tool in this case, but in general we don't consider it true. Thus, in contrast to Western mathematicians, Indians never tried to prove any mathematical theorem because it is not considered true. It is just useful sometimes, useless most of the time. The West, however, converted mathematics into infallible, universal, inviolable truth. As we discussed earlier, Enlightenment thinkers would say that God is a mathematical thinker. Studying mathematics was studying the mind of God. The highest virtue of God was that he made a mathematical universe because it was the most rational subject of all. Mathematics was called the queen of sciences because a queen was ruling England at that time. All this is factually nonsense. But Europeans elevated this nonsense to the highest truth. When Godel proved the incompleteness of mathematics, all these theological fictions behind modern science fell from grace and crashed into pieces. After that, doing mathematics was no longer studying the mind of God. The knowledge of mathematics was no longer the queen of sciences. It was just a tool. At this juncture, people stopped thinking whether an axiom was true or not. They would just make up axioms on whims and produce many kinds of theories because they were just tools. The result was that mathematics expanded rapidly into hundreds of domains. It became a toolbox with screwdrivers, hammers, saws, and drills. But still, proof was given the utmost importance because of the legacy of the past. The main reason behind this theology of mathematics is that Christianity took to mathematics, algebra, and science only to counter the Islamic conversion and colonization of Africa and Europe. They did not go to science for its own reasons. Their reason was religious. But today they say that science is separate from religion because both religion and the theology behind science have been disproven. Western science was started because of religion. The core dogmas of science were religious in nature. And when that dogma collapsed, then people started distancing themselves from religion and theological dogmas of science because they are known to be false. At one time, religion was an intimate partner. At another time, religion is a disreputable, distant cousin. This science religion aversion has never been the case in the Vedic system because BHEDA-ABHED is the fundamental principle of all reality, and independence, separation, and mathematics are just temporary illusions that are useful in some cases and useless in others. Hence, by both science and religion, we just mean BHEDA-ABHED. We don't mean mathematics. Mathematics is not science, it is just a technology or a tool to solve some problems. Everything that the West calls science is just technology for the Vedic system. The science, however, is completely different. Mathematical technology is opposed to religion, but the Vedic science is not opposed to religion. In fact, in the Vedic system, science is identical to religion.